Alabama has the longest constitution in the world, with over 800 amendments. It is longer than any nation's constitution. You might think a document that massive would give the state enormous flexibility, the power to solve any problem, fund any project, adapt to any crisis. But the opposite is true. That Constitution was written in 1901 with one explicit purpose: to lock power in the hands of a small elite and keep everyone else, especially Black Alabamians and poor white communities, from ever gaining enough control to change the system. And it is still working today. Alabama's prisons are so violent that the federal government has sued the state. Rural hospitals are vanishing. Counties are emptying out. Child poverty has barely moved in 20 years. Alabama is not falling apart because of bad luck or a changing economy. It is falling apart because the blueprint demanded it. The blueprint nobody repealed. To understand why Alabama is failing now, you have to understand what was built then. In 1901, Alabama's planter class and industrial elites, the so-called big mules of banking, railroads, and timber, convened a constitutional convention in Montgomery. They did not hide their purpose. The convention president, John B. Knox, a railroad lawyer from Anniston, said it openly in his opening address. The goal was to establish white supremacy within the limits of federal law, strip Black citizens of political power, neutralize poor whites who might form cross-racial coalitions with them, concentrate authority in Montgomery, and keep property taxes so low that Alabama could never build a functioning public sector. The 155 delegates, overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly wealthy, and overwhelmingly connected to the industries that ran the state, delivered exactly what they were asked to deliver. They embedded poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, tools designed to eliminate Black voters from the rolls with surgical precision. But the damage went deeper than voting rights. They eliminated home rule. That meant even small towns could not raise their own taxes, pass their own ordinances, or fund their own schools without permission from the state legislature, and in many cases they needed a statewide constitutional amendment. Think about what that means in practice. A county that needs to fix a bridge cannot simply vote to fix the bridge. It has to petition Montgomery. A town that wants to fund a new fire station cannot hold a local referendum and get it done. It has to ask the legislature for a constitutional amendment, then convince voters across the entire state to approve it. This was not an oversight. It was architecture. The men who wrote that Constitution built a fiscal straitjacket and welded it shut. They made sure Alabama would always be a low-tax, low-service state, not by accident, but by design. And then they made the design almost impossible to undo. Warehousing people in a broken system. But that old blueprint did not just create underfunded schools and crumbling roads, it created one of the most dangerous prison systems in America. By the 2010s, Alabama's prisons were packed to roughly 165% of capacity. Cells designed for one person held 3. Dormitories meant for 50 crammed in over 100. Violence was not an aberration, it was the texture of daily life. Guards were so scarce that inmates effectively ran entire dormitories. Weapons fashioned from bed frames circulated openly. Men slept in shifts because closing your eyes in the wrong bunk could get you killed. The U.S. Department of Justice investigated and used language almost never seen in federal reports. They called the state deliberately indifferent to serious and systemic constitutional violations. Homicides, sexual assaults, and beatings were not rare events. They were daily risks in facilities where staffing was so thin that entire wings went unmonitored for hours at a time. Nearly 700 incarcerated people died in Alabama's state prisons in the 4 years after the U.S. Department of Justice's first formal warning. 700 people. That is not a statistic that belongs in a modern American state. It belongs in a humanitarian briefing. But instead of reducing incarceration or overhauling conditions, state leaders made a different choice. They diverted roughly $400 million in federal COVID relief money, pandemic funds earmarked for healthcare, schools, and economic recovery, to help build new mega prisons. Even the governor admitted the state had waited far too long, yet the solution was more concrete, not less cruelty. More cells, not fewer prisoners. The money that could have kept a rural hospital open or funded a school district went into pouring foundations for facilities designed to warehouse the same people the system had already failed. The quiet collapse, nobody is watching. The prison crisis made national headlines. Federal lawsuits and Department of Justice reports put Alabama on the map for all the wrong reasons. But something even more devastating is happening in Alabama that almost nobody outside the state is paying attention to, and it is erasing entire communities from the map. When the last doctor leaves in 1980, 45 of Alabama's 55 rural counties had hospitals that could deliver babies. By 2024, only 15 did. Sit with that number for a moment. 40 counties, vast stretches of the state stretching from the Tennessee Valley to the Gulf coastal plain, became maternity deserts in a single generation. A pregnant woman in one of those counties might now drive 60 miles or more to reach a delivery room, sometimes on 2-lane roads through country with no cell service. Since 2011, at least 7 rural hospitals have closed entirely, not downsized, not merged, gone, with doors locked, parking lots cracking with weeds, the building standing like a headstone over the town that depended on it. In some of these communities, the nearest emergency room is now an hour away, an hour where a heart attack, a car accident, or a complicated labor becomes a question of whether the ambulance can get there in time and whether the patient can survive the ride back. More than half of Alabama's remaining 52 rural hospitals are financially at risk, and 19 are in immediate danger of shutting down. 83% of rural hospitals in the state operate at a loss. When a hospital closes, it does not just mean longer drives to an emergency room. Hospitals employ nearly 78,000 Alabamians statewide and generate roughly $25 billion in annual economic impact. In a rural county, the hospital is often the largest employer, sometimes the only employer that pays a living wage. When it goes, local businesses lose customers. Property values drop. The tax base shrinks. Young families with children look at a county with no hospital and no pediatrician and they leave. The people who remain are older, poorer, and sicker, which makes it even harder to attract a new employer or convince a doctor to set up practice. It is a death spiral, and once it starts, almost nothing stops it. The emptying, the hospital closures are not happening in a vacuum. They are one symptom of a broader collapse that is hollowing out rural Alabama, county by county. Some rural counties lost up to 20% of their population between 2010 and 2020, not over a lifetime, in a single decade. Dallas County, home to Selma, one of the most historically significant cities in the civil rights movement, lost around 5,000 residents in those 10 years. Its unemployment rate sits at roughly double the state average. Walk the streets of Selma today and you will see boarded storefronts, sagging porches, and empty lots where houses used to stand. The bridge where marchers bled for voting rights still spans the Alabama River, but the city around it is slowly disappearing. Across Alabama's Black Belt, named for its rich dark soil and not for demographics, though the overlap between the two is not coincidental, communities are aging, shrinking, and losing political power with every census. These are counties where the median household income can be half the national average, where a quarter of the housing stock sits vacant, where the grocery store closed years ago and the nearest fresh food is a 30-minute drive down a state highway. Fewer people mean less school funding, fewer services, crumbling roads, and less representation in Montgomery. And less representation means less ability to change the system that is causing the decline. The emptying feeds itself. Every family that leaves makes it harder for the next family to stay. The trap that keeps resetting every one of these crises, whether prisons, hospitals, or depopulation, traces back to the same root. The 1901 Constitution keeps property taxes among the lowest in the nation, and it blocks local communities from raising their own revenue. But here's the part that makes it nearly impossible to fix. Alabama's local governments cannot pass tax increases, change zoning rules, or fund their own schools without approval from the state legislature, or, in many cases, a statewide constitutional amendment voted on by people who do not live in the affected county and have no stake in its survival. That is why the Constitution has over 800 amendments. Hundreds of them are not grand policy changes. They are individual counties begging Montgomery for permission to do things that cities and counties in most other states do routinely: adjust a property tax rate, issue a bond for a school roof, hire an extra deputy, regulate mosquito control. One amendment deals with a single county's ability to dispose of dead farm animals. Another governs bingo games in a specific jurisdiction. The longest constitution in the world is not long because Alabama has the most complex governance. It is long because the most basic local decisions require a statewide vote. The result is a state that cannot sustain itself on its own revenue. Roughly 43% of all Alabama state revenue comes from the federal government. Federal funds make up about 73% of Alabama's Medicaid budget and nearly 18% of K-12 education funding. Alabama does not just lean on federal money, it depends on it the way a patient depends on a ventilator. Any reduction in federal funding does not just tighten the budget, it threatens the basic functions of the state: the hospitals, the schools, the roads, the safety net that keeps communities from collapsing entirely. And the irony cuts deep. A constitution designed to keep government small and taxes low has made Alabama more dependent on outside money than almost any state in the country. The men who wrote that document wanted a state that stood on its own. They built one that cannot stand without Washington. Building poverty into the next generation, but the fiscal straitjacket does not just affect hospitals and prisons. It reaches into every classroom in the state. Alabama's funding formulas send significantly less state and local revenue per student to high-poverty districts than to low-poverty ones. Districts serving more students of color also receive less. The schools that need the most get the least, and that is not a bug in the system. It is the system operating as designed. Child poverty in Alabama has hovered around 21% for roughly 2 decades. That number barely budged while the rest of the country improved. About 236,000 Alabama children live below the poverty line right now. Children who eat free lunch at school because there is nothing at home. Children who share textbooks because the district cannot afford a full set. Children whose classrooms lose heat in January because the maintenance budget ran dry in October. The schools that serve them are the least funded, the most understaffed, and the most likely to lose experienced teachers to better-paying districts across the state line in Georgia or Tennessee. The system does not just fail the current generation, it engineers the next one into the same position. Underfunded schools produce a less skilled workforce, which makes the state less attractive to employers, which keeps wages low, which keeps poverty high, which keeps the tax base small, which keeps schools underfunded. The loop resets every generation. And every generation, the gap between Alabama and the rest of the country widens a little more. The children who grow up in those underfunded classrooms become the adults who cannot attract the employers who could fund better schools for their own children. The cycle does not break on its own. It was not designed to. The warning that extends beyond one state. Some scholars have started using a specific term for what is happening: Alabamafication of America. The argument is that Alabama's model, with low taxes, minimal public services, punitive criminal justice, gerrymandered districts, and weakened local democracy, is not unique to Alabama anymore. Other states are adopting versions of the same playbook, centralizing power, starving local governments of revenue, and building systems that are very difficult to reform from the inside. The tools look different. The language is more polished, but the architecture rhymes. What is happening in Alabama is not just Alabama's problem. It may be a preview of what happens when the blueprint spreads, when a system designed to serve the few becomes the model for governing the many, the machine that runs itself. So why is Alabama quietly falling apart? Not because of a single disaster, not because of one bad policy or one failed election. Alabama is falling apart because 124 years ago, a group of men sat in a room in Montgomery and designed a system to keep power concentrated and public investment starved. They succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. The prisons overflow because the system was never built to rehabilitate. The hospitals close because the tax base was never allowed to support them. The counties empty out because the communities were never given the tools to sustain themselves. And the Constitution, the longest in the world, amended over 800 times, still holds. Not because it cannot be changed, but because changing it requires the permission of the very people who benefit from keeping it the same. Alabama is not broken. Alabama is working exactly as it was built to work. That is the problem.